You know, there are no limits. You know, question authority when it's appropriate, but be obedient when it's also appropriate. You know, faith, kindness, love, those were all specifically things he said. I can remember that expression one time when I told him I couldn't do anything, and he blurted out in half anger, but he blurted out, he said, there's never been a dumb Reno, and you're not going to be the first. You can do this. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of pressure to throw on a kid. And he was half angry when he said it, but I know what he meant by it. And you know, don't sell yourself short. There's a lot there. And these things come up again as you have your own kids. You try to convey a message in a way they understand it. And there are times you lose patience, and you wish you said it more eloquently. I'm sure that he could choose his words better on that one. But I understood what he meant. I worked in a hospital, Central General Hospital, and my dad helped me get in. Once you're in, that was it, though. You had to hold your own. And it wasn't unusual for, quote, a doctor's kid to be segregated, and then that's it. As a summer job, get out. Well, I didn't want any part of that. If I was going to work there, I wanted to learn something, and that's what he said. Don't work in some superficial job pushing wheelchairs. Learn something. If you're going to do it, learn something. So I became an apprentice in the engineering department. I was trained first on air conditioner repair. Spent the whole summer working with a bunch of World War II veterans, some Korean War veterans, hardcore, real tough birds. They didn't know I was a doctor's kid. I didn't bring it up. It was never mentioned because that could be your death knell in the hospital, especially when I took one of the real jobs, not one of the push the gurney jobs. I'm just making money for the summer. I'm going to be fired jobs. And I kept my mouth shut. And they would really, I was an apprentice. I'd clean their instruments, watch, shut my mouth, and be the ridicule of a lot of jokes. That's the way it was. And these were World War II guys. And I'd hear endless stories. And they were all wounded, every one of these guys. I remember Billy Labrico was the carpenter there, who happened to be a guy who worked at Fairway Lumber, where my dad, when he first bought the house, used to buy his lumber. And my dad knew Billy Labrico. My dad didn't tell him I was his son. And Billy didn't put the story together. And Billy would talk to another guy named Big Al, and Big Al lost part of his foot. And they would tell stories about what it was like to be in Korea as a machine gunner. And I'd just listen, and then I'd get made fun of quite a bit, you know, as being useless, and I didn't know anything. And I shut my mouth and took it and listened, and I learned, and eventually I got my own shift. Eventually I was repairing air conditioners as good as the next guy. I was there for 7 years. I joined the Long Island, the local 1115 Union of Long Island Hospital Engineers. When the summer was over, I was offered a job every time I came back. I literally had my own shift. I was E3. Had my own toolbox, my own pouch, my own. So I worked many years in the engineering department, and I worked 1 year beyond when I became a veterinarian. I became a vet. I was a doctor, and I came back that summer and finished out the last summer as a doctor working in the engineering department. Well, throughout the course of this, I learned a lot. Carpentry, electrical, plumbing, besides air conditioning, boiler repair. My father would see me in the hospital periodically. And he knew not to run up and give me a hug and kiss hello like we normally greet. He would walk by and give me the nod, and I'd be fixing something. And every once in a while, I'd be in the emergency room, my dad would walk over and go, no, tie that wire off over there and do this. He'd give advice. I remember I was in the shop one day and somebody questioned me and said, what's with the pediatrician telling you how to fix the air conditioner? And I said, I don't know. He's some guy trying to help me out. They didn't put it together. This went on for a long time. I didn't want anyone to know. And there would be times I was in the boiler pipe would explode and there's scalding water, and I'm in the boiler room on a high extension ladder trying to shut the pipe down and fix something. And my dad was looking for me. I remember one time he let himself in the boiler room, and he's giving orders, and I'll shut this off. And I said, Pa, go back to work. You can't be here. I'm the engineer. You can't be helping me fix the pipes. But he always wanted to get his hands in there. And he always had some dad. There's no question. He always had something to help me with, but it wasn't appropriate. I was trying to be my own man. Well, it was a strike. And I became friends with these guys that ridiculed me. We played payroll poker. We would go bowling. I became one of the guys eventually. Still, they didn't put this story together. Although a few of them, Billy Labrico figured out that I'm Lenny Marino's kid. But they kept it kind of quiet. I think they kind of knew, but no one ever said a word to me about it. And there was a strike. And I was in the union. I had to strike. And I remember coming home to dinner talking to my dad. There's a strike at the hospital. What's going to happen? And my dad was loved by the employees. He was the working man's doctor. With all the doctors, you would see Cadillacs. You didn't see Mercedes back then. You saw Cadillacs and Lincolns. My dad drove a '67 Plymouth and would park it in the doctor's parking lot. And he proudly parked his old station wagon in there because that was the car he drove, and I didn't need to drive a fancy car to prove anything to anybody. So the employees loved him. And he was a very friendly guy. Didn't stop to say, always stopped to say hello, whoever, to talk to anybody. And then the strike breaks out, and the doctors are crossing the picket lines. And I said to my dad, we're going to work tomorrow. What are we going to do? And he said, you know, you got to treat me like anyone else, son. It's a strike, dude. This is what happens in the real world. You're striking for your rights. And there my dad pulls up, and I see the employees striking, and I got my sign, unfair, unfair, you know. Here's my dad pulls up to cross the line, and people back up. They're kind of giving my dad a pass, the employees, because it's Lenny Marino, and he's got his station wagon. They give him a pass, so I just figure I gotta treat him like anyone else. So I jump up on the hood of his car, and I start screaming, "Scab, scab," and I start yelling at him. And he's looking at me, shaking his head like, "You can't believe you're doing this." And I'm screaming, "Unfair, you're crossing our line." And everyone's going, "Get off his car, get off his car." And I got down, and they were like, "What are you doing? That's Lenny Marino. Isn't that your father?" And I said, "He said treat him like anyone else." So he pulled in, he parked, and later that night I came home for dinner, and he said, "Son, I appreciate you not giving me any special treatment, but you don't need to jump on the hood of my car again." And I said, "You're right, Pa. I just wanted to make sure you're treated like everyone else." So, you know, he again, no special treatment. I didn't ask for it in the hospital. He did get me in there, but I kept my job beyond what any doctor's kid ever kept his job. No one worked that many years, especially as a doctor. I did it on my own merit, and he taught me the value of that. You know, I got you in, but you sink or swim on your own merit. And when there were layoffs because of the strike, my boss went down there and fought for me to keep my job, not because I was a doctor's kid, because I produced. And that was the message he taught me. And I guess no special treatment went the other direction, but in a misguided way. But yeah, it was an important message he taught me. My dad had a work hard and play hard type of work ethic. And he did. When he was in his office, he was in his glory. I could remember visiting him, and you would see him bounce between room to room with such precision. You almost didn't want to say anything because you broke his rhythm. So when he worked, he worked. And then when it was time to come home, he was ready to be our dad. And it was difficult because the many hours kept him away from some of the traditional events you'd see him at. So as a son growing up, my dad almost never made it to a Little League game. Almost never. My mom was there for me, but not my dad. And Cub Scout troops, he made it to as many as he could, but not as many as most dads. But I knew why, and my mom made it clear why. So although the quantity of time might have been different than most dads spent with their kids, I knew why. The quality of the time he did spend was probably triple the value of what most kids got out of it. Yeah, my dad was careful not to be my buddy. It's good to have a dad who's a buddy, but you need a dad. A dad is more than just your buddy. I had buddies. I was a kid. I had lots of buddies. I needed a dad, and he was a dad. And he was a dad for me and a dad for a lot of my friends, whose dads might have been around more often, but didn't fulfill that role, that more of an authoritative role. I think sometimes as a parent, you get trapped in trying to be your kid's friend as opposed to a role model for them, or an example for them to follow. So my dad made a point of that. And he would share his experiences, again, not just with me, with my friends. I don't have a single friend that wouldn't say my dad's the most amazing guy in the world, as they would say about my mother. You realize it over time. You don't realize what you have at the moment. So yeah, when we had family events, my dad was it, and they were orchestrated by my mother. I don't want to undershoot my mom by any level. Family events were my mom's world. Absolutely. My mom, as much as my dad worked and provided and set these examples about work ethic, it was my mom that was in charge of our life, the other end of the equation. So every family event was orchestrated and executed by her, and my dad was invited to show up and perform, and he did. He was our dad, and he did those things. And some of them he was quite out of his element. I remember one time, my dad was born in Sicily, on an island, and we grew up on Long Island. You would think he knows something about boating or fishing. My dad has no boating or fishing experience in his life. I don't.
He was 2 years old when he came here.
All right, but I know nothing. I can't convey a word about fishing or boating to my children because I've never been exposed to it. And we grew up on an island, and he's from an island. So it's a little awkward. And I remember my dad making an effort. He took me fishing one time. It was horrific. It was horrible. We went twice, and one time it was just, I remember we went to the dock. He didn't know what he was doing. He'll tell you he doesn't know what he's doing. And we threw the lines out there, and we caught buckets of seaweed, and we must have tied up 20 people's lines throughout the entire day, people were throwing things at us. They hated us. And I remember at the end of the day, I thought, I got to spend time with my dad. That was really but it was so embarrassing. I mean, even he was embarrassed. We kept cutting our line just to let the line go and try to string a new line and all. He tried. He tried to create that fishing and boating experience, and that was what mattered most. But, these were things he wasn't exposed to as a son of an immigrant, a poor immigrant. Fishing and boating were luxuries. It was about staying alive. It was about working, so you had food, so you had financial security, so you could pay the mortgage and have food for the next day. So going fishing and boating wasn't on his list of things to accomplish by his father, and unfortunately translated down to me. But there was no attempt or no lack of trying on his part. We went camping a couple times in the Boy Scouts. My dad never camped in his life. It was horrific. Watching my poor dad try to camp but he was out there. He was out there doing it. He slept in the tent. As miserable it must have been for him, he did it. So he certainly tried. He was out of his element in a lot of these things, whereas my mom was more relaxed and more into it. But he did his part. He did try. It's very hard to talk about my mom a little bit, because there's no little bit about my mom. My mom did just about everything when you think about it. In the capacity of a mom, she had 4 kids, she had a husband, each kid needed their own individual needs being met. So she organized the family. So she was the CEO of the Marino family and ran it. Whereas my dad respected the differences. Whereas my dad said, I'm going to work and generate some income. She equally ran that family and the family budget and buying food and making sure there was a social life for she and my father, which oftentimes gets sacrificed in marriages that get very busy with kids. 4 kids, all socially active. First and foremost, my mom provided a house of warmth and love. We all felt loved by my mother. We all knew she cared. She was there for us. Whether we were sick, had to be picked up from school, needed help with our homework, my mom was there. She set the example socially, whereas my dad was raised by his parents that barely spoke English, and Grandpa's schooling was fairly limited. He was maybe too rustic. And my dad didn't develop that social skill set that my mother had. My mom came from Grandma Rapisardi, this robust skill set of how to interact with people. My mom was the mayor. And my dad knew it. My dad respected that. So in the town of Plainview, my mom knew the butcher, the fish person, the cleaner, everybody by first name. It wasn't unusual for us to walk into a place and they're handing us loaves of bread and things to take home, to try. So my mom was that person. She was the center of the family and kept it all humming. There wasn't a night, there wasn't a hot meal with multiple courses that was at a level that was inconceivable until you get old enough to eat somewhere else. We grew up, there was always salad, bread, some sort of entree, vegetable, there was dessert, every meal. There would be sometimes soup too. So you'd have my mom's signature veal cutlets, you'd have some linguine with clam sauce, maybe some soup or not, and some salad and some bread, and that was dinner. And every night, to a T, the table was set by my sisters, the meal prepared by my mother, and then we were excused from the table so my mom could have coffee and cake with my dad, and we sat in the den, and then we came in and had dessert and wrecked it afterwards. And she made sure that happened every single night. So my dad walked home, there was a hot meal ready every night. The kids were told to back off the old man when he walked home because he's just walking in the door. She made sure our homework got done before we played. Until you have kids, you have no idea. Running a family operation is a full-time job. So having 4 kids come home, get their homework done, then go out and play and get home for dinner, cleaned up, have that dinner ready. Planning meals. She's planning social, who's going to Little League, who's going to Girl Scouts. My mom was my den mother for Cub Scouts, which meant a whole lot of work planning that. She did things with the Girl Scouts with my sisters, the softball coach for my sisters. So she did all of that stuff, and I'm not even sure how she did it. When we look back, I have no idea how she did it for 4 kids, because almost every Friday night, we'd be sitting there on the couch, the babysitter would come over, and there was my mom, decked to the hilt, the hair's all done, she's got the high heels on, there's my dad dressed up, and they would go out. Every Friday night they go out for dinner with their friends and maybe different, I don't even know where they went. They went to dinner and they were all dressed up nice. Sometimes they'd come over, Aunt Dolores and Uncle Tony, the Sansettas, the Parisis, Uncle Ralph and Aunt Joan, and they'd go out as couples and do whatever adults do. We had no idea what they did. We had babysitters, but we saw them go out every night. So she somehow organized that too with her friends. So she really somehow put it all together. So my mom had her stroke probably in 94, 95, so I was probably 40.
And how did that impact you?
The stroke was devastating. I remember I got the call from my dad. My mom struggled with weight issues for a while, so it was something on my dad's concern list for my mother for years. And to be very frank, it's a difficult thing to manage. My mom struggled with it, several different attempts made, but it was not something she ever overcame. So no one expected at her young age that this was going to hit. So when it did, it was quite devastating. I flew down there. I mean, I got the call from my dad. Actually, I wasn't in my residency. I misspoke. I was working at AMC at the time, but I got the call from my dad, and I flew down there immediately. I wasn't even sure how to get down there. I remember I called my sisters and my cousin Nina and said, I'm heading out. And I remember I called the airlines. I think there were 4 connecting flights. I don't even know where I was going. I just got on one plane and stood standby and stood standby and stood standby until I ended up in Texas. I remember getting there at midnight, and I remember it was 4 flights to get to Texas, to get there as fast as I could. I remember arriving in the airport, and I ran into Aunt Joan and Uncle Ralph, who flew up on a separate flight because she was emergency medically evacuated from Mexico. So everyone, Aunt Joan and Uncle Ralph were like the longest term friends of my parents, and there they were, and I was there, and my dad and my mom, and we were blown away. I remember looking at the MRI, it looked like an explosion. It looked like an explosion, and I had been using MRI as a modality in dogs, so I was familiar enough to know it was devastating. Devastating. She was still communicating and talking to me and that kind of stuff. And the first thing we all said is, we got to get her home. Got to get her home. So, and that's not easily done. When she's paralyzed, can't walk, it became something that, a team effort, But shy of my sisters who would have loved to have been there, I'm sure. Everyone was there to do it. So we had to get her on the plane and get her up here. And it's difficult. It's your son, and these are a vulnerability for a parent to be cared for by their kid. She's a young woman to be having her kid care for her. It's not like she's in her 90s. But here we are, and that's what family is. You do what you got to do. And we got her up here, but it was a long road, and it impacted her hugely. Hugely. It changed a lot about who she is. You can't go from the center of the universe, the mayor of the family, the mayor of the town, the commander of everything, to the person who has to be cared for. She's the one who cared for everybody. So it was devastating.
Tell me some more about it.
Well, it changed a lot. It really shook our family. It set the stage for her early passing. The stroke is only the first phase. It's physically debilitating, but it was mentally debilitating. Physically, my mom was playing tennis. You couldn't be more active. I mean, she was all over the place. She probably put 100,000 miles on her car, driving from event to event. This is a woman who, in high school, she didn't just was the mom in high school. She was the therapist for my sisters, all her friends, mediating relationship issues and running the fashion show, to she's in a wheelchair. And all of a sudden, driving is going to be an issue and things like that.
She did rally, though, at some point. She did drive.
She did. She got back to the point of driving, but it was a long road, and never the way she was. She did rally. But it was the start of her not being herself. That wasn't mom. And she knew it. But to her credit, you didn't ever see her without her hair done and the outfit on. She was grandma's daughter. And that's the way it is. This may be a setback, but it's not. She wasn't going to allow it to change who she was as best she could control that.
How did it impact you?
Well, it's difficult to see your mom, who's in charge of everything, be the person who now needs to be cared for. She didn't move as quickly as she could. She had a cane or assistance to walk. But like I said, her persona was still there. She got up every day, had her hair done, put her makeup on, put on the outfit that's fashion forward, that sets the stage for my sister Jackie. She wasn't going to abandon those elements of who she was. And I think that spoke a lot about who she is. This was a devastating life experience, but it wasn't going to change who she is. She got up, addressed the T's, and did as best she could from the limited capacity she had. But it did. It became a problem for her to be fully who she was.
And then she had a heart attack.
Yeah, I mean, stroke is devastating physically, and it's devastating psychologically, and eventually it takes a toll on your body. And she had been having some issues later in years, as in now in 2000, and I got the call from my dad, that you better get over here quick. So.
And the impact.
Well, I think it rocked the family. I'm sure my sisters share that experience too. I think the call came at roughly 5 o'clock in the morning. So I was probably there 10 minutes later with my dad. And my dad, who had gone through the experience of doing CPR on his own mother, is now faced with doing CPR on his wife. So the two most important women in his life. Yeah, watching my dad do CPR is rough. Who does CPR on their mother? Right? So.
And he is still deeply impacted.
Yeah, my dad talks about his mother growing up in such a level of reverence. His mother was the center of his universe, the one who put up with his father and molded him into the father that produced the son and took care of his brothers. And my mom was that to both me and my sisters. So there's that connection. And here he is watching this happen the second time in his life. My dad, as a young physician, went to visit his mother, who had a lung tumor in the hospital. She went from having no signs at all to having a lung tumor that's being diagnosed. And his father and his mother are supposed to move out of the city and move to Bethpage. They're getting out of the city. That's the thing. The American dream. They bought their own house finally. And his mom arrests in the hospital. He's paged back to the room as a code. So having that traumatic experience, there's my dad at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I remember I got dressed and raced over there and called my sisters right away, but I don't think they got there. I don't remember them making it in time. I beat the ambulance there. I mean, I probably drove, I remember pinning the car at 90. So, yeah. So, but we were all there when she passed.
Can you tell me a little bit how you felt?
Well, we knew she wasn't coming back by the time we got to the hospital. I mean, my dad, having arrived with my dad trying to do CPR, the ambulance showing up, they're pumping her, trying to do what they can. And the ambulance rushes her to the hospital, and we knew at that moment it wasn't going to happen. So my sisters arrived. The Parisis are called. Little Ralph, who's like a second son. And the doctors told us it wasn't going to be. I mean, her heart hasn't stopped. She's on her life support, and it's probably not going to change at this point. She's suffered irreparable damage. So once everyone who needed to be there was there, we had to make the decision to stop. And she passed, but she passed with family. We never knew him as Mimi. Mimi is the nickname that the adults called Grandpa. So Grandpa Marino was quite the character. And most of my grandparents weren't very fluent in English. In fact, only my grandmother Grandma Rapisardi was fluent in English. Most of my grandparents spoke Sicilian and some level of Italian, Tuscan dialect. But so there was a language barrier right out of the chute. So to get to know my grandparents meant you had to communicate beyond just speaking to them. There was a body language, there was more to it. So Grandpa Marino was not notoriously an affectionate guy, at least from what I hear growing up from Uncle Nino and my dad. Yet to us kids, he couldn't have been prouder. He was the guy that I was named after, so there's a special attachment to Grandpa Marino there. I'm Dominic, he's Dominic. That's really how he's known, as Domenico. He was a farmer, and a proud farmer, and that never left his bloodstream. He was a farmer in Sicily, and when he came to Queens and lived in Ridgewood, he had a little plot of dirt that he called a garden, but it produced like I've never seen anyone produce. He managed to string tomato plants up and have every few inches a plant in the ground, and he would come every weekend with things he grew and give away to his friends, tomatoes, zucchini, just about anything. So he was a very proud man. You want to cut and I'll get rid of him?
Yeah,
He was a proud man. He was a hard-working man. He was very family-oriented. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. They were very interesting people to me. Even though they're English, there was an English barrier, and I learned some of their phraseology in Italian. I spent a lot of time, and he was probably one of the most difficult of all the grandparents to get to know.
how so?
He went to school for only a few years, and I wouldn't say he was socially adept. He was a bit abrupt, less refined than, say, Grandma Rapasardi, but he got his message across. So he would speak frankly and directly. Most of our relationship was based on doing things together. So it was very common for him to come over for a family event and take me out in the garden and start teaching me about planting and weeding. It might be Easter Sunday and we were dressed up, and he would say, come with me. And he'd look at this and say, you can't plant this way. These plants won't pollinate correctly. They're not going to grow. The soil here is too, and he would spend an hour critiquing the garden and how I could do a better job. And he was right. And I would sit out there and do that. I'd spend that time. It was incredible time spent because I learned a lot from him, and I saw the pride he had in the work. He would spend countless hours talking about the family. He was very proud of his father, his grandfather. They all came to the plate for him and for us in different ways. So I was constantly reminded that although we've all achieved some level of success, it was on the shoulders of those that came before us. I mean, he lost his father, and I'll never forget it, his constant phrase. I lost to my father in the First World War, and the finger always came up every time he talked about it. It was devastating. So his boyhood experience was being raised by his grandparents, which is a little different than being raised by your parents, and it had an impact on him. And then sharing the stories about how he had to leave school. His favorite thing was school. You wouldn't have guessed it. His favorite thing was to learn, and he wanted to be a veterinarian. He loved horses and wanted to be a vet. It may have played a role in why I wanted to be a vet. So he wasn't able to go to school. He had to support the family. He had to work the family farm, and he, placed that on me. Let me know that you have an opportunity to go to school. Don't squander it.
What else did you learn from him?
The value of hard work. He came to this country with nothing, and he ended up putting his kids through higher education. My dad became a physician. Uncle Nino rose through the ranks supporting the military and developed a career that no one could envision, and has seen the world. And all this on the hands of the parents, Grandma Marino, who worked nights in the public schools to clean, and Grandpa, who worked like a dog, as he would say, to put it together for his kids. So the hard work, the gift for others, the personal sacrifice, these are huge messages, and the respect and love for animals. I think Grandpa would rather spend an afternoon with an animal than he would a person. Grandma Marino's the hardest one to speak of because we lost her in 1970, and I was 6. So my recollections from Grandma are I can say I virtually can't remember an English word from her. My recollections of her were her facial expression. She was a big woman who communicated her love through a smile and a grasp. I think if you asked any of us kids, my sisters included, what do we remember of Grandma Marino would be the cheeks being pinched and literally lifted off the ground. We'd see Grandma coming from across the room. Ours would tear up saying no, and here she came beaming and say, Bella, Bella. She'd grab you by your cheeks, and then your feet would start to lift, and you'd be off the ground as she said, Bella, Bella, Bella. And that's my fondest memory. There are a few other scant memories, but it was mostly that, her love for us, and the fact that she couldn't really speak to us because her English was fairly poor at the time, and it was mostly Sicilian. And at that time, I couldn't understand a whole lot, other than I knew she loved us.
Do you know why they immigrated here and the stories behind it?
I know them through stories being told. So you lose some of it, but my recollections and my discussions through Grandpa, were events that took place in Sicily. Grandpa was working hard and securing his family's future in Sicily, working farms. And I later went back to visit each of the farms that he developed to see, to validate these stories almost, to see it firsthand. And it was an amazing venture back. But he got to a certain level of success and was called upon by the local, back then the Black Hand or the Mafia version in Sicily, to contribute, make the monthly contributions that would secure your safety. And Grandpa told me much later on, I mean, early on we were spared a lot of stories because it wasn't considered good for us to know. But later on he shared with me that there was a circumstance where he was warned to ante up and to pay up. And he wasn't going to do it on principle, and that he had hid a weapon in the field. And when the time came for him to pay up and push came to shove, he ended up killing a man to prevent what was going to take place. And from that moment on, his life changed, that he had to leave. It became known that something had happened and that he had to leave. And he left. He left that country. So I'm sure in there's a story that has some elements of that in there. That's my recollection of how sad he was, because he gave up a lot. He gave up a life of farming that he dreamed of. He had a level of success, and he never saw it again. He left, came to America with my dad and his wife, and worked in factories. I mean, he worked in factories and never saw that farmland again. And it bothered him. You could see it in his eyes. So he was very proud of what he did. He rose to the level of the supervisor because he could speak some English. And most people would argue whether he could speak some English, but of all the immigrants, he was the one who could translate. And his stories are phenomenal. I remember one day driving across the Queensboro Bridge with Grandpa. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. It was just, to me, the greatest gift to have access to your grandparents like I did. I appreciated it most when I heard from my other kids, my colleagues, my friends that only visited their grandparents a couple of times a year. But driving across the Queensboro Bridge, complaining, and you didn't complain much in my family because there was always someone who had it harder than you. But driving a stick shift truck, and it was summertime, and I was complaining my arm was tiring me from shifting back and forth and downshifting in traffic. He reminded me that when he came over, he used to drive a truck. He said, across this very bridge making deliveries. He said, and the truck back then had hard rubber tires. There was no air in it. So every bump, your back would grind, and you sat on a wooden bench. And he said every once in a while, the lanterns would blow out, the headlights would blow out because they were lanterns. The wind would blow, and he'd have to get out in the rain and relight the headlights. And he told me the story of his cousin who went to start the truck, and it backfired on him and broke his arm. And then he had to work. Grandpa, he said, there's no insurance. He said he couldn't work for a couple of months, so I had to work to support both families until his arm healed. He told me stories about it, what it was like to deliver. But interesting enough, he never complained about that truck story. That was just to remind me how lucky I have it because I had power steering, and he didn't have that. But he felt he was lucky he had the truck because they used to deliver with a horse. He said, the truck was a gift. He said, we had a horse back then, and then we had a truck. So, everything's relative, is what I learned from him. And as bad as you have it, it could be worse. So be thankful for your blessings was a great message. He conveyed, for a guy who only had a few years' education and spoke very little English, he had a lot to say.
Clearly, you feel a tremendous amount towards him. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, he was a role model, I think. My dad and my mom went to college and were educated and had a tremendous impact on my life. What I'm amazed about as I reflect on my grandparents is how much of an impact they had with very little education, and some of them couldn't even speak English, yet they impacted us. And I think that's a tremendous message for my kids. I tried to explain to one of them that recently about how it's tough to understand Grandpa because he's from a different generation. He knows rotary dial phones and we text. And I said, I had that same problem with my grandparents. I said, Papa speaks English though. I said, could you imagine get to know your grandparents when they didn't even speak the language? There's something there. I said, if you look, there's something there, but you have to take the time to look. I had connected with Grandpa for the reasons I spoke about, but one of the interesting things that happened in our life was, and I was high school age, and I had this affection and interest in my grandparents and their stories. I was getting ready to leave for college now, because I'm 18, I graduated high school. And I said to my dad, I have an idea. And he thought it was a bad idea. I got to admit, my dad didn't think this was such a good idea. I said, I'm going to ask Grandpa to ride to Alabama with me and take me to college. And I was probably actually 19. It wasn't the first year I went, it was the second year. So I was comfortable with the journey. It's an 18-hour drive through the South. And I had experienced this, so it's my second year going to college. So I told him about a month before, I said, you know, I could use some help going to college. Maybe you can help me out. And that's all he had to hear. He didn't want to be some tag-along. He didn't want it to be some mercy. It had to be a real effort. And I made it sincere. I really need your help unpacking when I get to the other end. From that month on, he must have told every friend he knew how I got to help my son. My grandson, he's going to Auburn. I'm going to help him to go to Alabama. And he couldn't wait. He told everyone in creation. So we were leaving for the trip. And we were leaving at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I said goodbye to my friends around 11, 12 o'clock. I was leaving for Alabama. I went to bed, and around 4 o'clock in the morning, the doorbell rings at our house. And I went downstairs. I couldn't believe the doorbell's ringing at this hour. And there's my grandfather. He's got his fedora on. He's got one of those old-fashioned hard suitcases that he called the valise. And he stood there with his fedora